people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. It's official. Hyun Choi will be taking on unbeaten up-and-comer, novice boxer, kickboxer turned pugilist from Japan, Ringo, next month on the 15th. sports a professional record of 3 wins, no losses, no draws. 2 knockouts. A fighter that normally campaigns as a bantamweight. To say that Hyun Choi is taking it easy, to say that Hyun Choi, the long-reigning WBA super featherweight champion, to say she's taking it easy with this fight would be an understatement. Ringo's quality of competition so far in what are just 3 professional contests, 3 professional bouts, is about as ambitious as you can expect it to be for a novice boxer with only 3 pro bouts. 2 girls making their pro debut and 1 journeywoman with an upside-down record. Ringo won a regional version of the WBO title at bantamweight. She'll be venturing north of bantamweight for this fight, moving up 2-3 weight classes. Just about from bantam past super bantam, past feather, up to super feather, 130 pounds, where Hyun Choi has reigned as that division's WBA champion for something like 8 or 9 years now. It's a bit disgraceful, to say the least. It's disgraceful because Hyun Choi had the opportunity to unify titles with Michaela Mayer, had the opportunity to unify titles with Alicia Baumgartner, but those offers were rejected, and this is what we're getting in its place. Hyun Choi hasn't been the most prolific fighter, the most prolific champion, averaging 1 fight a year, just 1 fight a year for the last 4 years. She only boxed once in 2018, only once in 2019, only once in 2020, and only once last year. This will be her first fight this year. If you're wondering how it is that Hyun Choi was able to hang on to that title in what is such a deep talent pool, such a deep division, such a deep weight class, so many different fights with so many different fighters, capable ones to go around. If you're wondering how it is that Hyun Choi has reigned as this division's WBA champion for approximately 8 or 9 years, just look at her schedule. She barely fights. She barely gets out there and defends that WBA title, and that could lead to an extended reign as a champion. That's more or less what we saw with Gary Russell Jr., who was averaging 1 fight a year for approximately, 4, 5, 6 years? It's not a coincidence that this is the longest reigning champion, but also the least active one. Japan's own unbeaten Ringo has been a little bit more busy the last 12 months or so. She debuted as a pugilist, as a professional boxer in April of last year. She's boxed 2 more times since then. She debuted in April, squeezed in another fight in August. More recently, she was in action in April of this year. And you know, that is the kind of schedule that an unbeaten up-and-comer in boxing needs to be on. They need to be boxing regularly, getting rounds in the bank. But as stated, the quality of competition is only about as ambitious as you can expect it to be for a 3-0 novice crossing over from kickboxing over into boxing. 2 of those girls were making their professional debuts, and another one was a journeywoman with an upside-down record. As you can imagine, you don't look at this and get the sense that Ringo is ready for a title fight, let alone a title fight up there at super featherweight when she herself has been campaigning as a bantamweight. Yeah, Hyun Choi's going for the low-hanging fruit. Hyun Choi, who some time ago was signed by Matchroom, though looking at this, you don't get the sense that Matchroom is in any way, shape, or form involved in this promotion, involved with this show set to go down next month on the 15th. I think what the play here is, the play for Hyun Choi and her team, they're waiting for the winner of Baumgartner versus Mayer. Hyun Choi's only boxed once under the Matchroom banner. That was the Calista Salgado fight. And that must have been a one-off deal, because in her very next fight, she returned to her native South Korea, took on seasoned journeywoman Simone De Silva in what wasn't a Matchroom show. And this upcoming show, this upcoming fight, this ain't a Matchroom promotion either, so you get the sense that whatever business she did with Matchroom, it was short-lived. Strange that this is the same Hyun Choi who was scheduled to unify titles with Maiva Hamadouche right before the pandemic shut everything down. She was willing to unify then for what was likely less money than she stands to make now with Alicia Baumgartner, with Michaela Mayer. If she was set to unify with Maiva Hamadouche, it was a very dangerous fight at the time. What changed? And I think the play here is, rather than unifying titles with either champion beforehand, they're going to wait the situation out. Why unify with Alicia for X amount of dollars now when you can let Alicia and Michaela take each other out and you've got the last puzzle piece? I think that's the strategy. I think that's the tactic. Perhaps the Hyun Choi people told themselves, why unify with Michaela? Why unify with Alicia now when what we can do is sit on our hands and wait? Let those two champions unify with each other to ways we got the last alphabet title, we've got the last puzzle piece, which will then allow us to ask for more money. More or less what we saw with Caleb Plant and Canelo Alvarez. You might recall that Canelo Alvarez actually approached Caleb Plant 2 times before the fight actually took place, and Caleb wanted to hold out. Caleb wanted to wait. Caleb wanted to be the last guy that Canelo Alvarez ends up unifying titles with. Could that be the play here with Hyun Choi and her team? It's possible. It's just as possible that she's not interested in unifying, that she likes whatever domestic money she's making in South Korea, and she doesn't want to gamble. She doesn't want to risk losing that WBA title. Both scenarios are plausible. In any event, she's going to be taking on Ringo on the 15th of next month, and we're going to give Ringo a look to see just what exactly Hyun Choi is up against and to see whether or not Ringo stands a chance. In other news, per a tweet from Michael Benson, Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn is reportedly being held up by a dispute over the rehydration clause. It's understood that a 156-pound catch weight is agreed, but no resolution yet on the limit for a second weigh-in on the day of the fight itself. 156 pounds, that's basically a middleweight contest. Anything north of 154, in between 154 and 160, that's middleweight. That's a middleweight contest. Most people are assuming it's the Conor Benn people pushing for the rehydration clause because he's the naturally smaller fighter moving up. He's the one who would stand to benefit the most from such a clause, a rehydration clause that doesn't allow Chris Eubank Jr. to rehydrate, but so big, but so many pounds after the initial weigh-in. If anybody's going to benefit from that and push for that, it would be the naturally smaller fighter, and that's what Conor Benn is. I've said it many times in the past, I'll say it here and now again. Conor Benn isn't the biggest welterweight, you understand. Yeah, he's small compared to guys like Jaron Boots Ennis and Virgil Ortiz. These are the kind of guys to where they have such generous physical dimensions, they can move up there to junior middleweight, perhaps even as high as middleweight, and still be competitive on some level. The ideology of catchweights is to put both boys on even terrain, on an even playing field, because at least one of these guys has a size advantage. And the ideology behind rehydration clauses is that while the guy might weigh a certain weight at the weigh-in, he might rehydrate well above that weight, so much so that he will have a noticeable size or weight advantage. Conor Benn being the fighter who's moving up 2 divisions, 2 weight classes for this fight. If he's pushing for a rehydration clause, I don't blame him. Chris Eubank Jr.'s campaigned as high as super middleweight. A lot of people, they're not crazy about catch weights and rehydration clauses, like to criticize them and those who implement them from their high horses. But need I remind you that 1, Conor Benn is a lot smaller than Chris Eubank Jr. and a lot less experienced as a fighter. And by all rights, Chris Eubank Jr., given where he is in his career, he shouldn't be looking at welterweights. This is a guy who swapped punches with Billy Joe Saunders, Arthur Abraham, and unbeaten Avni Yildirim. Guy who fought reigning WBA super middleweight champion George Groves up there at super middleweight. Not only are these fighters campaigning in very different divisions, very different weight classes, there are those differences to address, but they're also in very different places in their careers. Conor Benn is very much still an unbeaten up-and-comer making his bones as a professional. He hasn't even boxed for an alphabet title yet. Chris Eubank Jr. is insistent that he wishes to cross over from Sky and Boxer to box a Matchroom fighter as part of a Matchroom show, a fighter who's not in the same place in his career, not campaigning at the same weight. You're goddamn right you gotta make sacrifices, because you ought to be fighting somebody your own size. I'm not critical that Conor Benn and his team may be pushing for not just a catch weight, but a rehydration clause, because this isn't a title fight. There is no major alphabet title on the line. If there were, there would be ethical. There might have been something to be said about that, because that would have been a title fight. Whereas this This is more of a novelty act, a novelty fight based on the rivalry of their fathers, Chris Eubank Sr. and Nigel Benn, their previous meetings all those years ago. That's what this is.
No, I'm not critical that the naturally smaller fighter wants catch weight and a rehydration clause because Chris really ought to be boxing middleweights anyway.
Oh, you might be telling yourselves that what the Conor Benn people aspire to do is drain Chris Eubank Jr. and weaken him. That might be the case. That might be true. But what do you think Chris is trying to do, boxing a goddamn welterweight?
Is that your interpretation of him boxing the very best competition that's out there?
What, you think that Chris is looking for a fair fight and Conor Benn isn't? If that's the case, why is Chris Eubank Jr. looking south for opponents, south of middleweight, when there are plenty of middleweights to go around? There's an unbeaten one that goes by the name Eubank Jr, who's in a pole position to fight for the WBO title. Why don't you take him on instead of a welterweight who's still making his bones as a pro?
What do you think? You think that Chris Eubank Jr. was calling Kell Brook to come out of retirement?
You think he's calling out a guy who spent most of his career campaigning as a welterweight, now in the end stages of his career? You think he was calling a guy like that out because he wants a fair fight? You think he was looking at Terrence Crawford, yet another welterweight, because Chris wants a fair fight and Conor Benn doesn't? Why is he looking at Conor Benn?
He's looking at Conor Benn because he wants a fair fight, or is he looking at Conor Benn because he wants the most rewards for the least risk?
You got an unbeaten up-and-comer in Eubank Jr. You could have saw about fighting that guy to get yourself in position to box Dmitry Bivol. Hell, if you wanted Andre, you could have had him because you spent some time over there at Matchroom. Unbeaten, two-division WBO champion Dmitry Bivol.
I'm just giving it to you straight. Neither guy's looking for a fair fight.
Chris Eubank Jr. least of all. Conor Benn likely does hope to drain Chris Eubank Jr., take something out of him so his chances are better against what is the naturally bigger fighter. Of course he does.
But the same is true in reverse.
Chris Eubank Jr., having campaigned as both a middleweight and a super middleweight, can't be targeting a welterweight because he's looking for the biggest challenge.
This is not a champion or a pound-for-pound fighter we're talking about.
I say if Conor Benn can impose that catch weight and that rehydration clause upon him, so be it. This ain't a title fight anyway. All's fair in love and war.
What's on the other side of this fight for Chris Eubank Jr.?
Not much, I think. How many people are going to be shouting from the rooftops that he beat Conor Benn, a guy who's still making his bones as a professional and a welterweight? The same cannot be said in reverse. It's Conor Benn who's really risking it all here. And if Conor Benn can pull this off, Eddie Hearn will have himself another star, another bright young fighter in the Matchroom stable that can perhaps fill the shoes of Anthony Joshua if things go sideways this summer with Alexander Usyk.
Unfortunately for Anthony Joshua, a lot of people don't think he's going to win that rematch.
If he doesn't, how do you replace a guy like that? A guy who's made the splash, and not just the domestic UK boxing scene, but the global one, in all the same ways that Anthony Joshua has made a splash. Well, Conor Benn could be the heir apparent.
Anthony Joshua is a guy who on more than one occasion got Saudi Arabian millionaires putting up big cash, big scratch for his fight.
Conor Benn pulls this off, he could become that guy, that heir apparent, become the face of Matchroom boxing, at least in some markets, if he can secure the W against Chris Eubank Jr., because in many ways, it's Conor risking it all, not Chris. Chris is trying to take on a goddamn welterweight.
This fight is somewhat of a novelty act, though it is a commercially viable fight. This fight will sell.
And if Conor wins, he really does stand to benefit the most. And finally, in men's light heavyweight news, per tweet from Everything Boxing, Eddie Hearn has confirmed Dmitry Bivol is still under contract to Matchroom, #Boxing DAZN, via the DAZN Boxing Show. This is the opposite of what Oscar De La Coca led us to believe. He said he was working with Dmitry's manager directly, Vadim Kornilov, and that Dmitry Bivol was a free agent, a promotional free agent, no longer tied to Matchroom.
That doesn't appear to be the case, and Eddie Hearn would know.
It was in January of 2019, approximately 3 years ago, that Dmitry Bivol entered into a co-promotional partnership with Matchroom. Eddie Hearn would be the guy that knows Dmitry's situation because, well, he's been the one promoting him for the last 3 years. In any event, whether he's with Matchroom or not, he's still under orders by way of the WBA to take on Zurdo Ramirez, though at the same time, we know there's some effort going into making a Bivol versus Buatsi fight. For my money, the more aesthetically pleasing fight would be the Zurdo Ramirez fight because Joshua Buatsi...
He's not a prolific puncher. He picks his punches. He's more of a sharpshooter than a gunslinger.
They're both cerebral fighters in their own way, Joshua Buatsi and Dmitry Bivol. Neither man can be accused of winning their fights through strength of arms and strength of arms alone. It's accuracy.
Punch picking and sharpshooting.
Said it before, and I'll say it here now. I'll say it again. The Joshua Buatsi that I saw take on Ricard Bolotniks. More recently, the Joshua Buatsi that I saw take on his domestic rival, Craig Spider Richards. That guy looks a bit green around the gills. That guy doesn't look ready for a world title fight against the likes of a Dmitry Bivol. In all likelihood, if you put them both in the same ring, Dmitry Bivol likely outpoints Joshua Buatsi because Joshua's strong puncher that he might be accurate. He doesn't have the best work rate. He doesn't throw punches in bunches. And in order to fluster a more cerebral finesse fighting kind of fighter like a Dmitry Bivol, that's what you've got to do. You've got to crowd him, pin him down, and throw punches in bunches. You got to let your hands go.
That's more akin to what we see from Zurdo Ramirez than Joshua Buatsi.
Zurdo Ramirez is your, according to Hoyle, mid-range to inside pressure fighter that leads with the right hand. He's a southpaw.
More experienced than Joshua Buatsi and more physically imposing.
Zurdo Ramirez is a more straightforward guy with a more straightforward approach. He's a more physical, rough and tumble kind of fighter, and believe it or not, that's what you need to take a Dmitry Bivol out of his comfort zone. You've got to crowd him. You've got to be rough and rugged with this guy and rough him up.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that he wins so much as he has some of the right ingredients to make it a competitive fight.
Whereas with Joshua Buatsi, there's less chance of the fight's aesthetic being a full-scale war, an all-out shootout. I'd wager that Bivol versus Buatsi would look a lot like Bivol versus Spider Richards.
Ho-hum kind of fight that leads to a ho-hum kind of decision.
Zurdo Ramirez, on the other hand, would look to push the pace and put the squeeze on Dmitry Bivol. Pressure that guy. For better or worse, that's what he's going to do, and that makes for a more entertaining fight. More action.
There are varying opinions on Zurdo Ramirez. Some people like him, some people don't.
Some people think he actually wins this thing, and some people think he gets outclassed by the finesse fighting of Dmitry Bivol. In any event, for my money, Zurdo versus Bivol makes for a more entertaining, spirited affair than Bivol versus Buatsi, though ultimately, I'm okay with either fight. I could go for either one, though I like the Zurdo Ramirez fight a little more. The relevance of Matchroom still having Dmitry Bivol under contract is, it goes back to what I told you before. Who's going to do the show? Is it going to be Matchroom or is it going to be Golden Boy? And is that going to be a problem? Because Golden Boy Promotions, they ain't got that many bodies to spare. I think that any fight involving one of their guys, Zurdo in particular, they'd like to be the lead promoter. They'd like to be the ones doing the show because they ain't got as big a stable as Matchroom, even though both promotional outfits,
they've got the same broadcast partner.
Golden Boy Promotions is going to want their boy Zurdo Ramirez to have every advantage that he can have going into a Bivol fight because it's a title fight and they need to fatten up their stable. They need champions.
Let's be honest, Zurdo stands a better chance of winning a decision on the Golden Boy side of things than the Matchroom side of things, even though they're both in bed with DAZN.
I myself don't give a rat's furry fucking ass who ends up promoting the fight, but I'm pretty sure Oscar does, and I'm pretty sure Eddie does as well, so that's something you want to be mindful of.